Today, the global headphone market is worth over $40 billion. Billions of people around the world own at least one pair. But here's what most people don't know. The man who made all of this possible died in poverty, largely forgotten by history. His name was Nathaniel Baldwin, and his story isn't just about an invention. It's about genius, faith, controversy, fraud, prison, and one of the most unlikely origin stories in the history of technology. This is the story of a man who handcrafted the first modern headphones in his kitchen, revolutionized military communication during World War I, built a $1 million empire, employed two of the most important audio pioneers in history, and then lost it all. It's a tale that spans from the rugged frontier of Pioneer, Utah, to the corridors of the United States Navy, from the world-famous Salt Lake Tabernacle to a federal prison on an island in Puget Sound. Let's begin at the beginning. December 1, 1878. In the small town of Fillmore, in what was then Utah Territory, a baby was born into a family that had been shaped by one of the most dramatic migrations in American history. His parents named him Nathaniel, after his father. The Baldwin family were Latter-day Saints, Mormons, who had converted to the faith in its earliest days. Nathaniel's father had actually met Joseph Smith himself and had participated in Zion's Camp in 1834, an armed expedition to help persecuted saints in Missouri. After Smith's assassination, the elder Baldwin joined the Great Mormon Exodus westward, arriving in the Salt Lake Valley in 1852. There's something important to understand about the world young Nathaniel was born into. This was a community that had been driven from state to state, that had crossed 1,000 miles of wilderness to build a new society in the desert, that believed in self-reliance and hard work as articles of faith. Nathaniel's father had built Fillmore's first flour mill. He ran a lime-burning enterprise. He was a man who knew how to build things with his hands. And there's another detail about young Nathaniel's family that would become central to his life story. His mother, Margaret Oler, was his father's second wife. Nathaniel Baldwin was born into a polygamous household. In 1890, when Nathaniel was 11 years old, the LDS Church officially discontinued the practice of plural marriage through the Manifesto, bowing to intense federal pressure. The government had been conducting what were called polig hunts, seizing church property and threatening to disenfranchise the entire territory. The era of openly practiced Mormon polygamy was coming to an end, but not everyone accepted the change. And Nathaniel Baldwin, raised in a polygamous home, would eventually come to believe that the old ways were the right ways. This conviction would shape his entire adult life and ultimately contribute to his downfall. From his earliest years, Nathaniel Baldwin was different. He loved to learn, especially about science. While other boys his age were doing farm chores, Nathaniel was taking things apart to see how they worked, and then putting them back together, and then making them better. As a teenager, he didn't just ride a bicycle, he built one, from scratch, and that wasn't enough. He also constructed his own steam engine. Think about that for a moment. A teenage kid in rural Utah in the 1890s, with no formal engineering training, no internet to look up plans, no YouTube tutorials, building a functional steam engine. Baldwin was driven by an insatiable curiosity, but there was a problem. Fillmore didn't have much to offer a young man hungry for knowledge, so he left. He traveled to Provo to attend Brigham Young Academy, the school that would eventually become Brigham Young University. But Baldwin had almost no money. He couldn't afford proper housing. So what did he do? He found an old adobe hut and moved into it. The townspeople started calling it Baldwin's Castle. And here's the thing, he didn't just live in that hut. He furnished it. With furniture he made himself. Every table, every chair, every piece of his primitive household came from his own hands. This was a man who simply could not help but build things. From Brigham Young Academy, Baldwin moved on to Utah State Agricultural College in Logan. Then he did something remarkable. He went to Stanford University, one of the finest institutions in the country, and earned a degree in electrical engineering and physics. Picture the journey, from a polygamous pioneer household in Frontier, Utah, to an adobe hut in Provo, to one of America's premier universities. Baldwin returned to Utah not just as a tinkerer, but as a credentialed scientist. He was hired to teach physics and theology at what had now become Brigham Young University. In 1899, he married Elizabeth Ann Butler. He had a teaching position. He had a wife. He had respectability. His future seemed secure, but Baldwin's restless mind was about to lead him in a direction no one could have predicted. The Salt Lake Tabernacle is one of the most remarkable buildings in America. Completed in 1867, this massive domed structure was designed as a gathering place for the Mormon faithful. It can hold thousands of people, and it's famous for its extraordinary acoustics. You can drop a pin at the pulpit and hear it in the back row. But here's the thing about the tabernacle: it's huge. And in the days before electronic amplification, even with those remarkable acoustics, some seats were better than others. If you were sitting in certain parts of the building during general conference, you might struggle to hear every word the church leaders were saying. Nathaniel Baldwin attended one such general conference, and he couldn't hear. As he later explained, "Until that day, nothing was further from my mind than the problem of amplifying sound. But after that day, the thought could not be pushed into the background. It persisted to the point where I was unable to concentrate on anything else." This is how invention often works, not through abstract theorizing, but through encountering a problem in daily life and refusing to accept it. Baldwin had been working on building a boilerless steam engine, but that project fell by the wayside. His new obsession consumed him. How could you amplify the human voice? But before he could solve that problem, his life was about to take a dramatic turn. At BYU, Baldwin had become acquainted with a man named John Tanner Clark. Clark was a passionate advocate for plural marriage, not as a relic of the past, but as a living doctrine that the church had been wrong to abandon. Clark believed that a one mighty and strong would come to restore the church to its true principles. Baldwin was convinced, despite the fact that the LDS Church had now issued not one but two manifestos against plural marriage. The second in 1904, Baldwin publicly declared his belief that polygamy was right and that the church leadership was making a mistake. In 1905, Clark was excommunicated, and Baldwin was fired from BYU. Think about what that meant. Baldwin had spent years pursuing education, had earned a degree from Stanford, had achieved the respectability of a university teaching position, and he threw it all away for a religious conviction. With a wife and child to support, Baldwin took whatever work he could find. He became an electrician and air compressor operator at Mountain Lake Mine in Wasatch County. Later, he was hired by the Knight Power Company to operate a hydroelectric plant on Snake Creek near Heber City. When Utah Power and Light took over, he was transferred to their plant in Mill Creek Canyon, east of Salt Lake City. It was lonely work, tending machinery in remote mountain locations. But for Baldwin, it was also perfect. He had time to think, time to experiment, time to work on his obsession. Baldwin began experimenting with compressed air as a means of sound amplification. The idea was simple in concept, but difficult in execution. If you could create a valve sensitive enough to respond to the vibrations of a human voice, you might be able to use compressed air to amplify those vibrations into something much louder. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, but too good not to tell, about what happened when Baldwin got his compressed air amplifier working. A man was traveling up Mill Creek Canyon one day when he heard something extraordinary, a booming voice echoing off the canyon walls, but there was no one around. The man looked everywhere, bewildered and more than a little frightened. He kept walking up the canyon, following the sound, until he finally came upon the source, an embarrassed Nathaniel Baldwin, testing his new voice amplifier. Baldwin had created a loudspeaker, but he wasn't done. His mind was already moving toward something else, a device that wouldn't project sound outward, but would focus it inward, directly into the ears of one listener. By 1910, Nathaniel Baldwin had shifted his focus from loudspeakers to something more intimate. He was working on improving the telephone receiver, the part you held to your ear. The existing technology was adequate for phone conversations, but Baldwin believed he could make it much more sensitive, much more clear. His workspace wasn't a laboratory or a factory. It was his kitchen. Think about that image. A man who had studied at Stanford, who had taught at a university, now working at his kitchen table, winding copper wire around armatures, soldering delicate connections, testing and retesting and testing again. His wife and children moving around him as he pursued his vision. What Baldwin was creating used a technology called the balanced armature driver. Here's how it works. A metal armature, essentially a small piece of conductive metal wrapped in a coil, is balanced between two permanent magnets. When an electrical signal passes through the coil, it creates a varying magnetic field that interacts with the magnets, causing the armature to vibrate rapidly. This vibration is transferred to a thin diaphragm, which moves the air and creates sound waves. The key innovation was the precision. Baldwin's receivers were dramatically more sensitive than anything else on the market. According to some accounts, each earpiece contained a mile of coiled copper wiring. A mile. In each ear. But Baldwin didn't just create better earpieces. He created a way to wear them. Previous audio devices were single-ear tools, telephone receivers you held to one ear, acoustic horns you pointed at your head. Baldwin attached two of his improved receivers to a headband, creating a device that sat on your head and delivered sound to both ears simultaneously. He had invented the modern headphone. But there was a problem. Who would want to buy such a thing? This wasn't 2026, when headphones are as common as shoes. This was 1910. Radio broadcasting barely existed. Music was something you experienced live, in concert halls and parlors. Who needed a device to listen to things privately? Baldwin tried to interest commercial businesses in his invention. They weren't impressed. The homemade quality of his prototypes, handcrafted at a kitchen table, didn't exactly scream professional product. One rejection after another. But Baldwin had heard about someone who might be interested: the United States Navy. In the early 20th century, radio was transforming naval communication. Ships at sea could now communicate with each other and with shore stations across vast distances. But the weak signals required sensitive receiving equipment. Navy radio operators were using headsets, but the technology was primitive. Faint signals meant missed messages, and missed messages at sea could mean disaster. Someone, possibly the Smithsonian Institution, suggested Baldwin contact the Navy's radio division. So he did. He wrote a letter explaining his invention and offering to send prototypes for testing. The letter was written in violet ink on blue and pink paper. Lieutenant Commander A.J. Hepburn received the colorful correspondence. His first instinct was probably to toss it. Crackpots wrote to the Navy all the time with their revolutionary inventions, but for whatever reason, he gave Baldwin a chance. A package arrived from Utah. Inside a baking powder tin were two of Baldwin's handmade headphones. They were held together with clock springs and hemp twine. They looked like something a madman might have assembled in an asylum. A Navy researcher examined them and laughed out loud. Then they tested them. The laughing stopped. Baldwin's homemade headphones outperformed everything the Navy had. The sensitivity was extraordinary. Signals that had been unintelligible through standard equipment came through clear as day. The Navy wanted more. They sent an order. Baldwin had a problem. A wonderful problem, but a problem nonetheless. He was making these headphones by hand in his kitchen. He could only produce about 10 per week. The Navy wanted 100. At once. In the fall of 1914, Nathaniel Baldwin quit his job at the power plant and built a factory. It was modest, 12 by 14 feet, but it was a beginning. Located in East Mill Creek, along the creek that had powered his experiments, it represented Baldwin's transformation from lone tinkerer to manufacturer. True to form, Baldwin refused to simply buy electricity to run his machinery. Instead, he did what his father had done decades earlier in Fillmore. He built a water wheel on Mill Creek. Using bicycle wheels and piano wire, he constructed a hydroelectric generator that not only powered his factory, but provided electricity to the entire neighborhood. Then, in 1914, the world went to war. World War I transformed Baldwin's business overnight. Radio communication became essential for coordinating naval operations, directing air attacks, managing supply lines. The Navy's demand for headphones exploded, and Baldwin's Baldies, as they came to be called, were the gold standard. Radio men in the Navy, Air Service, and Signal Corps all used Baldwin headphones. Their superior sensitivity meant clearer communication, fewer errors, potentially lives saved. One veteran radio man later wrote, "I used a pair of Baldies while on the U.S. ship and they were indispensable." Baldwin hired workers and then even more workers. He expanded the factory. By 1922, he had constructed a large new facility and formally established the Baldwin Radio Company. At its peak, the company employed over 300 people, in some accounts, 150 on 3 shifts, producing 150 headsets per day around the clock. Baldies commanded a premium price. They sold for $12 per pair, equivalent to roughly $175 in today's money. The company was generating approximately $2 million in annual sales. Nathaniel Baldwin, the man who had been fired from BYU and had worked in remote mountain power stations, was now a millionaire. Baldwin's headphones became ubiquitous. Historical photographs show Henry Ford wearing a pair. Herbert Hoover, before he became president, used them. When KSL broadcast for the first time in May 1922, the engineer was wearing Baldies. Radio's popularity surged after the war. People across the country were building crystal sets and listening to the new phenomenon of broadcast entertainment and news. And many of them were doing it through Baldwin headphones. But there's something strange in this success story. The Navy, recognizing how valuable Baldwin's technology was, strongly suggested he patent the headphone assembly design. Baldwin refused. He considered it trivial. The Baldwin Radio Factory became more than just a manufacturing facility. It became a launching pad for some of the most important figures in audio history. One employee was a young man named James B. Lansing, though at that time he was still going by his birth name, James Martini. Lansing arrived in Salt Lake City around 1925, met his future wife Glenna Peterson there, and worked both for a local radio station and for the Baldwin Radio Company. If that name sounds familiar, it should. James Lansing would go on to found not one but 2 of the most important audio companies in history, Altec Lansing and JBL. The initials JBL stand for James B. Lansing. Today, JBL is one of the biggest names in speakers and headphones, with products used in concert venues, movie theaters, homes, and on the go around the world. Lansing's time at Baldwin's factory was formative. It was there, working with speakers and radio equipment, that he developed his passion for audio technology. The skills he learned in that Utah factory would change the industry forever, and there's another legend connected to Baldwin's factory, though this one is more disputed. According to local lore, another young man who worked there was Philo T. Farnsworth. The name might not mean much to you, but it should. Philo Farnsworth invented television. Born in Utah in 1906, Farnsworth was a prodigy who conceived of the key principles of electronic television while still a teenager. The story goes that he built some of his early television prototypes in Baldwin's factory. Whether this is precisely true or is an embellishment of history, it speaks to the kind of environment Baldwin had created, a place where brilliant young people worked on the cutting edge of audio technology. Think about what that means. In one factory in East Mill Creek, Utah, you had the inventor of modern headphones, the future founder of JBL, and possibly the inventor of television. It was like a Silicon Valley startup incubator, but in 1920s Utah, making radio equipment. But the Baldwin Radio Factory was known for something else, too, something much more controversial. Nathaniel Baldwin had never abandoned his belief in plural marriage. He had been fired from BYU for it back in 1905. He had been excommunicated from the LDS Church in 1922 for insubordination regarding his continued support for the doctrine. But unlike many who held similar beliefs, Baldwin now had the means to do something about it. Baldwin didn't just employ fellow believers, he actively supported the establishment of fundamentalist communities. Many of the officers in his company were leading polygamists, including Lauren C. Woolley, John Y. Barlow, Israel Barlow, Leslie Broadbent, and Lyman Jessup. These weren't random hires. Baldwin's factory served as a meeting place where fundamentalist leaders could connect, plan, and organize. It has been estimated that 10 to 20% of Baldwin's employees were either from polygamist families or were supporters of the doctrine. A former employee later recalled that, if you were interested in polygamy, Baldwin was interested in you. Baldwin built 12 bungalows along Evergreen Avenue to house some of his employees, particularly those with plural families who might have trouble finding housing elsewhere. The street became known as Polygamy Alley. He paid their bills. He provided jobs when no one else would hire them. He funded the printing of religious tracts defending plural marriage. When John T. Clark, the man who had first convinced Baldwin of the righteousness of polygamy back at BYU, wrote a book called The One Mighty and Strong, Baldwin contributed $750 to print 5,000 copies. Most significantly, Baldwin's factory facilitated connections that would have lasting consequences. It was there that Loren Woolley and his father John W. Woolley met the Jessup family. These employees, among others who worked for Baldwin, would go on to draw up plans for what would become the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the FLDS Church. Yes, that FLDS Church, the same organization that would later be led by Warren Jeffs and would become infamous for abuse, child marriage, and cult-like control. Its organizational roots trace back, in part, to meetings and relationships that formed in a headphone factory in Utah. Here's the irony. Despite his fervent belief in plural marriage, Nathaniel Baldwin himself only ever married once. He and Elizabeth Butler remained together until the end of their lives. His support for polygamy was ideological, not personal. By the mid-1920s, the Baldwin Radio Company seemed unstoppable. Millions in sales, hundreds of employees, products used around the world. Nathaniel Baldwin was worth millions at a time when $1 million was truly a fortune. But the seeds of destruction had already been planted. The first problem was Baldwin's generosity. He was a soft touch for anyone with a hard luck story, particularly if they were fellow believers in plural marriage. He paid bills, he built houses, he made investments based on friendship rather than financial analysis. The second problem was management. In January 1924, Baldwin replaced several experienced managers with fundamentalist associates. His grandson Kay Baldwin later explained, "They had changes in leadership. I think he replaced a lot of ones he had with people who were sympathetic to his cause." The results were disastrous. The displaced managers formed a competing company. Baldwin believed they were violating his patents and sued. Meanwhile, the new leadership ran the company into the ground. The Baldwin Radio Company was thrown into receivership. A bank took over, reshuffled personnel, and quickly returned to profitability, proving that the business model was sound. It was the management that had failed. Baldwin eventually regained control of his company, but his troubles were just beginning. There was also literal disaster. Baldwin had been building a road up Mill Creek Canyon, characteristic of his constant need to build and create. A sudden cloudburst flooded the canyon, drowning several workers and washing away his road. It was a portentous sign. At the urging of several associates, Baldwin formed a new venture, the Omega Investment Company. The idea was to sell stock in his radio business to raise capital. Stock was sold out of state, in Helena, Montana. But something went wrong. The sale involved fraudulent use of the mails for advertising. Whether Baldwin knew the details of what was happening or was simply trusting the wrong people, we may never know. But a federal indictment was filed against Baldwin and about a dozen other directors of the company. In 1930, Nathaniel Baldwin was convicted of mail fraud and sentenced to 5 years at McNeil Island Federal Prison. McNeil Island sits in Puget Sound, about 8 miles from Olympia, Washington. It was one of the oldest federal prisons in the country, having housed prisoners since the 1870s. This is where Nathaniel Baldwin, the Stanford-educated physicist, the inventor, the millionaire industrialist, spent the next 2 years of his life. True to his nature, Baldwin didn't stop working. Even in prison, he continued pursuing his experiments and electrical inventions. His mind never stopped, but while he was locked away, his company collapsed. The Baldwin Radio Company, which had once employed hundreds and generated millions in revenue, folded entirely. Baldwin served 2 years of his sentence and was released in 1932. He returned to Utah a broken man. The fortune was gone, the company was gone, and the prestige was gone. He never recovered. For the remaining 3 decades of his life, Baldwin lived in poverty. He continued tinkering, continued inventing, continued improvising new products. But lightning never struck twice. He never created another million-dollar business. He never regained his position as a prominent inventor and businessman. His religious commitments remained unchanged. He continued supporting the fundamentalist movement when he could, even though his resources were now almost non-existent. He still believed in the doctrines that had cost him his teaching position and his church membership decades earlier. Eventually, Baldwin moved in with his son Kelvin in Salt Lake City. The man who had built his own furniture in an adobe hut, who had constructed steam engines as a teenager, who had wired neighborhoods with electricity from generators made of bicycle wheels, was now dependent on his family's support. So what do we make of Nathaniel Baldwin? The headphone industry he pioneered is now worth tens of billions of dollars. The balanced armature technology he helped perfect is still used today in high-end in-ear monitors and hearing aids. When you put on your AirPods or your Bose noise cancelers or your gaming headset, you're using technology that traces its lineage back to that kitchen table in Utah. Companies like Beyerdynamic, Koss, Sony, and Apple built on the foundation Baldwin laid. The concept of personal, private audio, of being able to plug into your own sonic world, began with his work. The young employees who passed through his factory went on to shape the entire audio industry. JBL speakers are in half the world's movie theaters. Altec Lansing products were used at Woodstock. The technology that emerged from that incubator in East Mill Creek shaped how we all experience sound. And then there's the other legacy, the more troubling one. The religious movement Baldwin financed evolved into the FLDS Church, an organization that has caused enormous harm. Baldwin himself seems to have been a true believer acting on religious conviction, not a predator or abuser. But the money he provided helped establish a community that would later become something very dark. Can we separate the inventor from the man? Should we? History is full of complicated figures, people who created wonderful things and also held beliefs or supported causes that we now find troubling. Baldwin wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. What we can say is this: every time you put on a pair of headphones, you're participating in a revolution that began with a man who couldn't hear a sermon in Salt Lake City and refused to accept it. A man who built his own furniture, his own generator, his own factory. A man who shipped his prototypes in a baking powder tin and convinced the United States Navy that a homemade contraption held together with clock springs was better than anything they had. A man who could have patented one of the most important inventions of the 20th century, but thought it was too trivial. Nathaniel Baldwin was a genius who died in obscurity. He was a man of deep faith who supported a movement that would cause harm to many. He was an inventor who could build anything but couldn't run a business. He was a millionaire who died poor. He was a man who changed the world and was forgotten by it. His story is American to its core: the self-made inventor in his workshop, the dream of entrepreneurial success, the complications of religion and controversy, the meteoric rise, and the catastrophic fall. Next time you put on your headphones, to listen to music, to take a call, to block out the world, take a moment to think about Nathaniel Baldwin, the forgotten man who made it all possible, the inventor who thought his invention was trivial.